He had been looking for peace for a long time. After years of living in the city, surrounded by noise and people, he wanted a place where he could breathe, a place that felt alive but quiet. So when he found a small old house in the countryside sitting at the edge of a sleepy little town, he didn't think twice. The house looked tired, but there was something warm about it. The walls had cracks, the wooden floors creaked, and ivy had climbed halfway up the back wall. Still, it felt like the kind of place that could hold secrets, the kind that told stories if you listened closely. He moved in during early spring. The fields around the house were bright with yellow flowers, and the air smelled of wet soil and old wood. There was a backyard that stretched farther than he expected, ending in a line of trees that looked ancient. The real estate agent said it had once been part of a much larger estate, before it was sold off in pieces many decades ago. That didn't matter to him. He liked it just the way it was, quiet, private, and full of character. His first few weeks there were peaceful. He spent his mornings making coffee and listening to birds instead of traffic. He started a small garden near the back fence, planting herbs and a few vegetables. It felt good to work with his hands again, to feel the soil between his fingers. But one afternoon, while digging to plant some lavender, he noticed something strange, a patch of ground that looked darker than the rest. The soil there was softer, like it had been turned over not long ago, even though the rest of the yard was packed and dry. He paused and leaned on his shovel, staring at it. Maybe the previous owner had tried to grow something there, he thought. Or maybe it was where an old tree had been removed. It didn't seem important at first, so he ignored it. But over the next few days, he couldn't help noticing how that patch of ground seemed to stand out. It sat a few feet away from his garden bed, slightly sunken in, as if the earth had settled over something long forgotten. At night, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, he would find his eyes wandering back to that same spot. It made no sense, but he felt drawn to it. A few times he even thought he heard something faint coming from that direction, like a soft clinking sound, almost metallic. But when he got up to check, there was nothing there, just the sound of wind passing through the trees. He tried to brush it off. After all, living alone in an old house can play tricks on anyone's mind. The next morning, he got up early to finish his gardening. The sun had just started to rise, and mist hung low across the field behind the house. He dug new rows for tomato plants and then, out of habit, found himself near that same dark patch again. Up close, it looked even stranger. The soil wasn't just soft, it looked disturbed, like someone had once dug there and tried to cover it up in a hurry. Curiosity got the better of him. He took his shovel and started to dig lightly. He didn't plan to go deep, maybe just enough to see what was underneath. The ground was damp and gave way easily. After a few minutes, the shovel hit something hard. He stopped. It didn't sound like rock or pipe, it was hollow with a dull wooden thud. He knelt down, brushed some dirt away, and saw the corner of a dark, rotting board. His heartbeat quickened. It looked like a box, old and fragile, buried just beneath the surface. He cleared more of the dirt until the full shape appeared, a small wooden structure about 3 feet long and barely 2 feet wide. For a moment he just stared at it, unsure of what he had found. It looked like a coffin, but smaller than any he had ever seen. He sat back on the ground, unsure what to do. His mind raced through explanations. Maybe it was an old storage chest, maybe something left by the people who owned the land before. Still, something about it didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the ground itself was warning him to stop. He told himself not to be ridiculous. Old houses came with old stories. This was just another forgotten thing buried by time. He thought about calling someone, the police maybe. But what would he even say? I found a small box in my yard. It sounded absurd. Maybe he should just close it back up and forget about it. But then, the same curiosity that had driven him to buy an old house instead of a new one pushed him forward. He took a deep breath and started brushing away the rest of the dirt. When the box was fully exposed, it looked too worn to move. The wood crumbled in places where he touched it. The hinges were rusted and the top was sealed shut by age. He hesitated, gripping the edge of the lid with his fingers. The thought crossed his mind that maybe it was better left alone. But curiosity has a way of ignoring warnings. He pulled gently and the top gave way with a soft crack as the wood split. A rush of musty air escaped, thick and old. He turned his head, covering his nose, and leaned closer. Inside, he saw something he couldn't make sense of right away. It wasn't just dirt or debris. There were small bones, fragile and yellow with time. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It looked human, but far too small for an adult. Lying beside the bones was a porcelain doll with a cracked face, its painted eyes still bright blue despite the years. Next to the doll was a rusted chain with a locket and a small folded piece of paper sealed with what looked like old red wax. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. His mind was spinning so fast that he couldn't think clearly. He hadn't expected this, not even close. The small box, the doll, the bones, it all felt unreal, like something out of an old story no one should ever uncover. He stood there for a long time, unsure what to do next. Part of him wanted to run inside and call for help, but another part of him couldn't move at all. It felt wrong to turn his back on it, like the ground itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to do something. Finally, he reached down, hands shaking, and picked up the folded paper. The wax seal broke easily, as if it had been waiting for that moment. The paper was old, yellowed, and smelled faintly of smoke. He didn't open it yet. He carried it inside carefully, wiping his hands on his jeans before setting it on the kitchen table. He sat there for a long time, staring at the folded letter. His heart was still racing. The house was silent except for the faint creak of old wood settling in the walls. He looked out the window toward the backyard. The hole he had dug was still open, the small box half buried in the fading sunlight. He thought about what the real estate agent had said, how the house had once belonged to a family that left suddenly, years ago, leaving behind most of their things. Maybe this had something to do with them, or maybe it went back even further. He poured himself a glass of water and finally opened the paper. The writing inside was old-fashioned, the kind of cursive you only see in museums or history books. The ink had faded, but it was still readable. It began with the words, "To whoever finds this." His eyes followed each line slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he read the rest. The letter spoke of loss, regret, and something that had been hidden, not just physically but emotionally. The writer spoke about a child, her illness, and something she called a darkness that followed her. The words didn't make complete sense, but they carried a deep sadness. He set the letter down, feeling cold. Whoever had written it had buried not just the box, but a secret. Maybe they had done it out of fear or love or guilt. He didn't know. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had opened something that was never meant to be opened. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt louder than usual. The wind outside brushed against the windows and the wooden beams groaned softly in the dark. Around midnight, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he heard something faint, a small sound coming from the backyard. It was the same clinking noise he'd heard before, only this time it was slower, more deliberate, like metal tapping against stone. He sat up, listening. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. He got out of bed and went to the window, peering through the curtain. The yard was dimly lit by the moon. The patch of ground where he had dug looked untouched from a distance, but the shadows around it seemed deeper, darker. He rubbed his eyes and told himself it was just his imagination. Just the wind, just an old house playing tricks again. He went back to bed, pulling the blanket over his shoulders, trying to convince himself everything was fine. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The house didn't feel the same anymore. The air felt heavier, like it was holding on to a secret. And as he closed his eyes, the image of that small wooden box and the cracked porcelain doll stayed with him, refusing to fade away. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, but the house still felt cold. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that small wooden box and the porcelain doll staring up at him through the dirt. The letter lay folded on the table where he had left it, the edges curling slightly. He made himself a cup of coffee and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had followed him all night, but it clung to him like fog. He walked to the window and looked out toward the backyard. The patch of earth he had disturbed was still open, a shallow wound in the middle of the green grass. He thought about covering it again, pretending none of it had happened. But something about that letter wouldn't let him. The handwriting, the sadness in the words, it all felt too real to ignore. He needed to know who had written it and why the box was buried there in the first place. After breakfast, he put on his gloves and walked back outside. The morning air was cool, carrying the smell of damp soil and wildflowers. He stood over the small grave for a long time, just staring at it. It was strange to think that someone, maybe more than 100 years ago, had stood in that exact spot doing the same thing, but for a very different reason. He took a deep breath and knelt beside the box again. The old wood had begun to crumble overnight. It was so fragile that even touching it made tiny flakes break away. He decided to remove it carefully so he could see what else was inside. He used his hands instead of the shovel, scooping the dirt gently around it. The box was heavier than it looked, and when he finally managed to lift it out, it made a dull sound, like it had been holding something more than air and dust. He placed it on the grass beside him and looked inside again. The doll was still there, its cracked porcelain face tilted slightly to one side. The little chain with the locket had slipped closer to the edge, and the bones inside looked almost like small twigs in the morning light. He wasn't sure if they belonged to an animal or something else, and he didn't want to guess. What caught his attention this time was the small corner of fabric stuck under one side. He pulled it gently, revealing what looked like a tiny piece of cloth, maybe part of an old dress or blanket. The colors had faded long ago, but faint patterns were still visible, soft and delicate. He sat back on his heels, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. It didn't feel right to be touching these things, but at the same time, it didn't feel right to just bury them again without understanding. He stood up, brushed off his hands, and decided to find out more about the house. Maybe the local library or town office had old property records or news archives that could explain something. He changed clothes, grabbed his car keys, and drove into town. It was a small place with one main street, lined with old brick buildings and faded shop signs. At the far end stood a little public library that looked like it had been there forever. Inside, an elderly librarian greeted him kindly when he asked about historical property records. She led him to a corner where old maps and handwritten logs were stored. He spent hours there, flipping through pages filled with neat cursive writing and fading ink. Finally, he found the original record of his property. The house had belonged to a family more than a century ago, long before the land was divided. There was a note that caught his eye, a brief mention of a woman who lived there with her husband and a young child. After that, the record ended abruptly, replaced by a later entry showing the property had changed hands again only a few years later. He asked if there were any old newspapers from that time, and the librarian showed him a digital archive. After some searching, he found a short article from the late 1800s mentioning a tragic event at a nearby farm. The piece was vague but talked about a young girl who had fallen ill under strange circumstances, and a mother who was said to have lost her mind from grief. There were no names, no photos, just a small paragraph buried in a local column. But something about the date and location lined up too closely to be coincidence. He thanked the librarian and drove home with a mix of sadness and curiosity swirling inside him. The countryside rolled past his window in shades of gold and green, but he barely noticed. His mind kept returning to that letter, the bones and the doll. He wondered what kind of pain a person must have gone through to hide something so deeply and so quietly. When he returned home, the sun was already low. The long shadows stretched across the yard, touching the edges of the disturbed soil. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table again, unfolding the letter one more time. The words felt heavier now that he knew at least part of the story might be true. To whoever finds this, it began. The handwriting trembled in places, as if the writer's hands had been shaking. I could not bear to see her taken away. They said it was my fault, that she had been touched by something unholy, but she was only a child. I did what I thought was right. I laid her here myself where no one would find her so she could finally sleep in peace. Forgive me if you have opened what should have stayed closed. He read the lines again and again, feeling an ache in his heart. It wasn't just fear that filled the letter. It was guilt and love tangled together. The woman must have been completely alone when she buried that box. The thought of her standing there, under the same trees digging in the dark, made him feel a strange connection to her, even across all those years. As he sat there lost in thought, he suddenly heard a faint creaking sound coming from the back porch. He froze listening. The sound came again, slow and steady like footsteps on the old wooden boards. He got up quietly and walked to the back door. Through the glass, he could see the yard bathed in the pale light of dusk. There was no one there. The trees swayed gently, their shadows moving like dark waves on the ground. He opened the door and stepped outside. The air felt cooler now and the smell of earth was strong. He walked toward the patch of soil, every step echoing softly. When he reached it, he noticed something that made him stop. The lid of the box, which he had left resting on the grass, had shifted slightly. It was now tilted, half open again. Maybe the wind had done it, he thought. But there was no breeze. He crouched down and looked closer. Everything inside the box was exactly as before, except the doll. It had moved. Its cracked face, which had been turned toward the side earlier, now faced straight up, staring at him. He felt a chill run through him, the kind that makes the back of your neck tighten. He told himself it was just gravity, maybe the wood shifting as it decayed. But deep down he wasn't sure. He took a step back and stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. The smart thing would have been to call the authorities, let professionals handle it. But something about the situation felt too delicate, too personal. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a secret buried by someone who had been trying to protect what little they had left. He couldn't bring himself to turn it into something cold and official. Instead, he covered the box gently with a tarp to keep it safe from the night dew. Then he went back inside, closing the door behind him. He turned off the lights, sat down in the living room, and just listened. The old house creaked softly, but otherwise it was silent. Still, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. Later that night, as he tried to sleep, his mind refused to rest. He thought about the woman, her child, the old newspaper article. He wondered if anyone else had ever found this grave before him, or if it had truly stayed hidden all these years. Around midnight, he thought he heard something again. A faint humming, almost like a lullaby, coming from outside. It was so soft that he couldn't tell if it was real or his imagination. Either way, he didn't get up this time. He just lay there in the dark, listening until the sound faded away. By morning, the world looked normal again. Birds chirped, the sky was bright, and the air felt lighter. But something inside him had changed. He couldn't look at his backyard the same way anymore. It wasn't just a patch of grass and soil. It was a story, a memory, a place where someone had hidden both their love and their pain. He didn't know it yet, but uncovering that grave was only the beginning. What lay beneath wasn't just a forgotten box. It was a doorway into a story that had never truly ended. The morning light spilled across the old kitchen table where the letter still lay open. He hadn't touched it since the night before, but his eyes kept returning to the fading ink. The words were burned into his mind. There was something in the way they were written, like the writer knew someone would one day find them, even if she hoped no one ever would. It was a strange mix of guilt and hope. He wondered what kind of pain could push someone to write such a letter and then bury it with such care. He decided he needed to know more. The library had given him small pieces of the past, but he felt like he had only brushed the surface. There had to be more, maybe in the town's old archives or with someone who knew the local stories. Old towns always had people who remembered things others had forgotten. After breakfast, he drove back into town. The road wound between quiet fields and clusters of tall trees. The same mist from the morning before hugged the ground, giving everything a soft, pale glow. He stopped at a small shop that sold antiques and local crafts, hoping the owner might know something about the house's history. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust, and shelves were stacked with things that had stories of their own: books, clocks, faded photographs. Behind the counter sat an older man polishing a lantern. When he asked about the property, the man's hands paused for a moment. "That old house near the creek," he said. "It's been there longer than most of the buildings in town. Folks say it used to belong to a family that came here before the railway was built. Don't think anyone stayed there too long after that, though. People said strange things started happening after the little girl passed." The man leaned back on his stool, eyes narrowing as if trying to remember. "Can't tell you much more than that. But there's a woman who might know. She's lived here all her life. Keeps to herself now, but she used to help with the historical society before it closed down. She knows every story this town's got." He gave him directions to a small cottage at the far edge of town near the woods. When he arrived, the place looked peaceful. A wooden fence surrounded a neat little garden and smoke rose from the chimney. He hesitated at the gate, unsure how to explain why he was there, but finally gathered the courage to knock. An elderly woman answered the door. Her gray hair was tied back neatly, and she looked at him with kind but curious eyes. When he mentioned the old house, her expression softened. She invited him in without another word, as if she had been expecting him. They sat in a small living room filled with books, photographs, and the scent of tea. He told her about finding the box in his yard, about the letter, and about the strange feelings that had followed. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "I know the story," she said. "My grandmother told it to me when I was young, but she said never to speak of it outside the family. Still, I suppose it's been long enough now." She took a deep breath and began to tell him what she knew. Long ago, before the town had grown beyond a few dirt roads, a woman and her husband had moved into that same house. They were quiet people, kept to themselves, but they were respected in the small community. The wife was known to be gentle, though some said she had a sadness about her even then. The couple had one daughter, a bright little girl who always carried a small porcelain doll wherever she went. One winter, the child became ill. The doctor came, but nothing he did seemed to help. The illness lingered, and the child grew weaker each day. People in town said the mother stopped coming out altogether. The husband went to work at the mill, but was rarely seen speaking to anyone. Then one morning, the child was gone. The husband told people she had passed quietly in her sleep, and that he had buried her behind the house. But a few days later, he disappeared too. Some said he left from grief, others that something had driven him away. The woman remained in the house for a time, but she was never the same. The neighbors said they could hear her singing softly at night, lullabies the kind she must have sung to her daughter. And then one day she was gone too. The house sat empty for years after that. When the old woman finished speaking, the room felt heavy with silence. He didn't know what to say. Everything she had described fit perfectly with the things he had found: the doll, the letter, the grave. He thanked her for sharing the story, but before he could leave, she added one last thing. "Be careful with what you found," she said gently. "Sometimes when things are buried, they're not meant to be uncovered. The past carries its own kind of weight." He nodded and promised to be respectful, but as he drove back home, her words echoed in his mind. He couldn't help but feel that what he had found was more than just an old box. It was a voice from another time reaching out to be heard. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, he sat by the window with the letter once again. He noticed small details he hadn't before, the way the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been crying while writing it. He read the lines over and over, searching for meaning in every word. The letter mentioned something strange, a darkness that had followed the child, a whisper that wouldn't leave them alone. He wondered what that meant. Was it a metaphor for illness or something else entirely? Later, he walked out to the backyard, the fading light casting long shadows across the grass. The soil where the box had been buried was still disturbed. He crouched beside it, his fingers brushing over the cool earth. He whispered quietly, not even sure who he was speaking to. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said softly. "I just wanted to understand." As he stood up to go back inside, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the yard, strong enough to make the trees sway and the tarp he had placed over the box lift slightly. The air felt colder than it should have. He stood there for a moment, staring at the box, unsure if he should cover it again or leave it as it was. Finally, he bent down, adjusted the tarp, and pressed the corners into the dirt to keep it from moving. That night, he dreamed. In the dream, he was standing in the backyard again, only it wasn't night or day. It was something in between, the sky pale and endless. The ground looked untouched, no sign of the hole or the box. But there was a little girl standing near the trees, holding a doll. She didn't look sad, just quiet. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost like an echo. "She didn't mean to hurt me," the girl said. "She wanted to protect me." He woke up suddenly, heart pounding, the dream so vivid that he could still hear the child's voice in his ears. It didn't feel frightening, just deeply sad. He sat there in the dark for a long time, trying to calm himself. Maybe his mind was just trying to make sense of everything he had learned, but part of him wondered if the dream had been more than that. The next day, he went back to town to see if there were any official records about the family. Birth certificates, death notices, anything that could confirm their existence. The clerk at the small municipal office helped him search through the archives. After hours of looking, they found a single entry from over a century ago. It listed a woman's name, the same one signed at the bottom of the letter along with the date of her death. But there was no record of the child's burial, no mention of the husband. It was as if both had been erased from the town's history. As he drove home that afternoon, he felt an ache of empathy for the woman whose story had been buried so long ago. Maybe she hadn't been crazy or cursed. Maybe she had just been broken by grief. He thought about the doll, the letter, and the child's voice from his dream. Maybe all of it was connected in some quiet, unseen way. When he reached the house, the first thing he did was walk to the backyard. The sun was setting and the sky glowed in shades of orange and pink. He stood there for a long moment, watching the shadows grow longer. Then slowly, he knelt and placed his hand on the mound of soil. "I understand now," he said softly. "You're safe here. I'll make sure no one forgets." For the first time since he found the box, the air around him felt still, not cold, not heavy, just calm. The wind stopped. The trees stood silent, and as he turned to go back inside, he thought he heard something faint and gentle, a whisper, almost like a sigh of relief carried away by the evening breeze. That night, he slept peacefully for the first time in days. He didn't know it yet, but the story wasn't over. The past still had more to reveal, and the ground beneath his feet still held secrets waiting to be understood. The man couldn't shake off the strange feeling that had settled over the house since the night he read the letter. Every corner felt colder, every sound sharper, and every shadow heavier. It was as if the air itself had changed after he unearthed the small coffin. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of nerves, but deep down he knew it wasn't. The morning after reading the letter, he stood by the window staring at the backyard. The hole was still there, the broken wood scattered near it. The soil around the spot looked darker than the rest, damp even though it hadn't rained in days. The small porcelain doll he found beside the bones still sat on the porch table, its eyes slightly cracked and faded. He didn't know why, but he couldn't throw it away. Something in him felt like that would be wrong. He spent most of that day trying to distract himself. He turned on the television, cleaned the kitchen, even tried to mow the lawn. But every time he walked past the window that faced the backyard, his eyes went straight to that patch of earth. It pulled him in like a magnet. He tried to ignore it, but it was as if the ground itself wanted his attention. That evening, he sat outside on the porch with a cup of coffee. The air was quiet except for the soft hum of insects. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and red. For a moment, he almost felt calm. But then he noticed his dog, Max, standing near the back door, staring at the garden with his fur standing up. The dog refused to move closer to the grave. His growl was low and uneasy, the kind that came from pure instinct. The man called out to him, but Max wouldn't budge. He finally walked back inside the house and hid under the table. It was that night when the real unease began. The man woke up suddenly around 2 a.m., unsure of what disturbed his sleep. The house was dark and silent. He sat up in bed, his heart thumping. Then he heard it, a faint creaking sound like someone slowly stepping on old wooden floors. He froze. The sound seemed to come from the living room. After a few moments of silence, he told himself it was just the old house settling. He lay back down, but the uneasiness didn't fade. Just before he closed his eyes again, he heard something else. A soft tapping at the window, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. He turned his head toward the sound, and for a second, he thought he saw a small shadow outside the glass and the outline of a hand. But when he blinked, it was gone. His breathing grew heavy, and he didn't move again until morning. The next day, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. He went to the local library to look for information about the history of his property. The librarian, an older woman who had lived in the town her whole life, helped him find old land records. It turned out that the area used to be part of a large family estate in the late 1800s. The woman who had written the letter was indeed listed as a resident there, along with her husband and their young daughter who had died suddenly. The record said the family plot was supposed to be at the edge of the estate, not where his house stood now. Somewhere along the way, the land was divided and sold, and the graves were forgotten. The librarian frowned when she saw the name of the family. "You're not the first person to ask about them," she said quietly. There were stories about strange happenings around that property after the family moved away. People said the mother never forgave herself for what happened to the child. She stayed in the house long after everyone else left. When she finally died, no one wanted the place for decades. The man thanked her and left, but her words stayed in his head. When he got home, he noticed something chilling. The small doll that had been sitting on the porch table was now lying on the ground near the back door, as if someone had moved it closer to the house. He hadn't touched it. He bent down to pick it up, but the moment his fingers brushed it, he felt a sudden chill run up his arm. The porcelain was freezing cold even under the warm afternoon sun. He dropped it immediately. That night, the strange noises returned. He was sitting in the living room reading the letter again when he heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, heavy, one step at a time. His stomach dropped. He lived alone. Grabbing a flashlight, he slowly climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing in his chest. The air upstairs felt heavier, thicker somehow. He reached the top and shined the light across the hallway. Nothing. The doors were all closed. Then at the far end of the hall, the door to the guest room slowly swung open by itself. Just a few inches, enough to make the sound of the hinges fill the air. He stood there for what felt like forever, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He whispered a shaky hello, half expecting no answer. And there was none, and only silence. He gathered his courage, stepped into the guest room, and looked around. The curtains fluttered slightly, even though the window was closed. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. Then he saw it. On the floor near the window, a small footprint in the dust. A child's footprint. He backed out of the room quickly, shutting the door behind him. He spent the rest of the night downstairs, lights on, waiting for the morning to come. The next day, he decided to seek help. He called a local historian known for studying old properties. The man arrived later that afternoon, curious but calm. He listened to the story carefully as they stood in the backyard. When he saw the small grave, his face grew serious.
He explained that many families in the 1800s had private burial plots on their land, and sometimes graves were forgotten when properties changed hands.
He said disturbing them, even unintentionally, could cause emotional unrest. Not necessarily in a supernatural way, but through the energy and history tied to the place. The historian knelt beside the grave and spoke softly. "If this child was buried here in secret," he said, "there's pain attached to this ground. You can feel it." He suggested that the man rebury the remains properly, say a few words, and mark the site with respect. Sometimes, the historian added, it's not about ghosts or curses. It's about giving peace to something that's been ignored for too long. That night, the man sat by the window looking at the small mound of earth. He thought about the mother who wrote that letter, the pain she must have carried, the loneliness of her final days. Maybe all of this wasn't about fear. Maybe it was about memory, something or someone wanting to be remembered. The following evening, he decided to do what the historian said. He went to the backyard with a small lantern and fresh flowers. He placed the doll carefully beside the grave, brushing off the dirt. He whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb your rest. You're not forgotten anymore." The air around him was still, but for the first time in days, it didn't feel heavy. It felt calm. When he walked back into the house, he felt something shift, a strange mix of sadness and relief, as if a weight had been lifted. That night, he slept soundly for the first time in a while. But the peace didn't last. A few nights later, he woke again around 3 a.m. The air in his room was freezing. He could see his breath. The soft hum of the house was gone. Everything was silent. Then faintly from the distance, he heard it. A sound he hadn't heard before. It was soft and slow, almost like humming. A melody. A lullaby. He sat up, his heart pounding, listening closely. The tune was faint but unmistakable, like a mother humming to her child. It seemed to come from outside, from the backyard. Against every bit of logic, he got up, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and walked to the window. The moonlight fell over the small grave. The flowers he had placed there were moving gently in the still air. But no one was there. He stood there for a long time, frozen, listening until the sound faded away completely. Then the silence returned, and this time it stayed. He didn't know what to make of it. Was it his mind playing tricks, or had something been set free that night when he spoke those words? Whatever it was, it didn't feel threatening. It felt peaceful, like a goodbye. Over the next few days, the house felt lighter. The shadows didn't seem as deep, the nights not as cold. Max stopped growling at the back door and even lay near the garden again. The man still didn't have all the answers, but he no longer felt afraid. He began to understand that some things weren't meant to be explained, only respected. He knew then that he couldn't just walk away from what he'd found. He had uncovered more than an old grave. He had uncovered a forgotten story, a piece of someone's life that had been buried for over a century. And he couldn't help but feel that maybe somehow he was meant to find it, For a few days, everything seemed calm again. The man felt lighter, like the air in his home had finally cleared after a long storm. The strange noises had stopped, the cold spots were gone, and even Max seemed happy again. Each morning, the dog ran around the yard as if nothing strange had ever happened there. The man tried to move on with life. He worked on small repairs around the house, planted a few flowers, and even invited a neighbor over for coffee. But deep inside, he knew something about that place had changed forever. And so had he. He had spent many evenings thinking about the letter and the little grave. There was a sadness in those words he could still feel. That mother hadn't been crazy. She had been alone, scared, and heartbroken. And maybe more than anything, she just wanted her child to rest peacefully. That thought stayed with him. He didn't see the grave as a dark spot anymore. He saw it as a memory, something sacred that deserved care. A week later, he decided to do something special. He went into town and found a small stone marker at an antique shop. It was plain but beautiful, with soft edges and an old-fashioned style. He brought it home and spent the afternoon engraving it carefully with simple words. Forever remembered. He placed it at the head of the grave, set fresh flowers beside it, and stood there for a while in silence. That evening, while sitting on the porch, a gentle wind passed through the trees. The sound of the leaves reminded him of a soft whisper, almost like a thank you carried through the breeze. He smiled without thinking. For the first time since moving in, the house truly felt like home. But peace, as he would soon learn, sometimes has a way of testing you before it stays for good. A few nights later, he woke up suddenly, the same way he had during the earlier weeks. His room was quiet, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. He sat up, listening. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, faintly, he heard it. A soft creak like a floorboard being stepped on. It came from the hallway outside his door. His heart began to race again. He told himself to stay calm. Maybe it was just the wood settling or Max moving around. He slowly got out of bed and walked toward the door. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the window. He stood there, holding his breath, waiting. Then, from the far end of the hall, he heard something. Not footsteps this time, but a quiet humming sound. The same lullaby he'd heard before. It was faint, almost like a voice carried through air. It didn't sound scary or angry, and just soft and lonely. He followed the sound slowly down the hall, each step careful and quiet. It led him to the living room. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. The room looked calm, nothing out of place. The moonlight shone through the window, casting pale light on the floor. Then, just for a brief moment, he thought he saw something. A small figure standing near the window. It wasn't clear or solid, more like a shimmer, as if the light itself had taken shape. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing the backyard, humming that same lullaby. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it faded away. The sound stopped. The house was silent again. He stood there frozen, trying to understand what he'd just seen. But strangely, he didn't feel afraid. It didn't feel like something dark. It felt like a goodbye.